I'm David Acton, Curator of Photographs at the Snipe Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame. Here are some observations on the works in our exhibition, Touchstones of the 20th Century. Many of the photographs in the show were made by journalists for publication, so I'd like to discuss some of those today. The profession of journalism emerged in the era of World War I, when the printing industry found access to techniques for reproducing photo-derived images simultaneously with text. So these could be printed in newspapers and magazines. Now, at the beginning of the war, the combatants were aware of the propaganda value of photographs, and so they tried to keep photographs from being published, and they didn't assign professional photographers into the field. But by this time, cameras were common, and the soldiers themselves took their own cameras into the field, made pictures of their experiences, and especially in Germany, these started to appear in the press when the German press specifically bought photographs from soldiers. Relatively soon, the other combatants realized that photography could not be controlled, and so they developed their own institutions of photography. I'm showing on the right a photograph made by a photographer who was probably a soldier, now nameless to us, who shot this picture with a stereographic camera, and those images were later published. On the left, an image from late 1917 shows a group of Allied photographers who were deployed into the field, members from French, American, British armies. During the 1920s, a pivotal figure in the history of photojournalism in Europe was Dr. Erich Salomon. He had studied law and science and had become a skillful photographer when he realized that he could infiltrate places where other photographers were not allowed. He famously took his Armanox camera, which you see him holding on the left, and took it into a courtroom in Germany, hidden under a bowler hat, in the crown of which was a hole, and he made images of this sensational trial that were later published. Salomon was smart enough and sophisticated enough to talk his way into very high negotiations. And we see on the right an image of diplomats discussing reparations after World War I in a hotel in Rome. Salomon was comfortable navigating in this world, was able to make himself unobtrusive, and took these photographs without anyone knowing, photographs that were afterwards published in newspapers. A key to his success, of course, was the use of miniature handheld cameras, and he was expert with the Armanox camera and the Leica camera. Salomon shared his knowledge of the Leica camera with his friend Alfred Eisenstadt and showed Eisenstadt how also to make enlargements from the small film contained in these cameras. And Eisenstadt became an important photojournalist, and in fact, in many ways, the father of American photojournalism. He made photographs in Europe for World War II. The photograph that we see on the right, taken with a small camera, is his famous shot of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi who scowls in being photographed furtively by a Jewish photographer. The photograph in our exhibition by Eisenstadt is a famous image from the inside of an opera house in which he used his small camera to reach up and capture a point of perception that included the sweep of the architecture from high in the stalls in this Milan opera house. In the earlier discussions, we've spoken about Henri Cartier-Bresson, a French master in the use of the miniature camera. We see him here on the right with one of his photojournalist images taken after World War II in France when a collaborator with the Germans is exposed to her fellow townsmen. Cartier-Bresson was adept at hiding his camera, and he even took his Leica and covered the silver parts of the metal body with black tape so he could hide the camera under his coat, and it didn't become obvious when he pulled it out to take a candid shot. The photograph in the Snite collection included in our exhibition is this one that Cartier-Bresson took in a church in Lisbon, where he captured the moment where a confessor kneels before a priest at a prie-dieu in the middle of the nave of the church. Before World War II, Cartier-Bresson shared digs with two other photographers, André Friedman from Budapest, whom we see here on the left, who became known as the photographer Robert Kappa, and Dawid Shimzin from Warsaw, who became known as the photographer David Seymour, or Chim. These photographers were dissatisfied with the system by which their work was sold to books and magazines through agencies which took a cut and kept the copyright of the photographs they had captured. This is an image by Robert Kappa of the Spanish Civil War. Kappa worked in Spain along with his girlfriend, Gerda Taro, who was also a war photographer, and together they invented the persona of Robert Kappa. French publishers paid higher prices for these images by Kappa, thinking him a famous American photojournalist, and Americans did the same, thinking him a European master. This is the photograph in our exhibition, which is called The Last Man to Die. It was taken by Kappa in Leipzig late in World War II when he was with a group of American machine gunners. They came into the city and made their way into an abandoned apartment building. They made their way upstairs and set up a machine gun on the balcony of the third floor, hoping to protect the Americans coming into the city over an adjacent bridge. Kappa was photographing this unit in this room the moment that a young machine gunner was killed, and he made a series of photographs of the young man's death and the responses of his fellow soldiers. Later, these photographs were put together for a series of images published in Life magazine. This is the spread in Life, where you see the young soldier and a comrade on the left, their faces blocked out because it was uncertain at the time of publication whether his family knew of his death. A great photojournalist who distinguished herself during World War II was Margaret Burke White. In 1936, the American publisher Henry Luce had the idea of publishing an American picture magazine. He was already publisher of Fortune magazine, for which Burke White worked as a photographer specifically of industrial subjects. He tapped her to be the original photographer for Life magazine, and her photograph of the Fort Peck Dam was published on the initial issue of Life in November 1936. During the war, Burke White worked in Europe, in Russia, and also had many assignments in the United States. One of these was when she visited Gary, Indiana in 1943 to cover the efforts of the women who were working in industry. And this image of women beveling armor plate for tanks with acetylene torches was published in Life at a time when the Office of War Information encouraged American publishers to work on projects involving women. This also happened to be the moment when the popular song Rosie the Riveter was on the charts. Burke White accompanied American troops when they liberated the concentration camp at Buchenwald and took this famous picture on the right. In her later career, she traveled around the world for Life magazine, creating important photo essays on such figures as Mahatma Gandhi and Sir Winston Churchill. Even during the war years, not all photojournalism was serious. Bill Brandt, the German-born British photographer, worked as a photojournalist for Lilliput magazine, publishing essays about England. One of his most famous photo essays was a collection of the images of young British authors. And here's a spread representing portraits of Stephen Spender on the left and Dylan Thomas on the right. An entirely different mode of photojournalism was practiced for tabloid magazines and newspapers, which were popular during the war and afterwards. The most famous proponent of this photography was Arthur Felig. He was born in Poland and came to the United States as a young man and worked as photographer's assistant and a laboratory technician at Acme News Pictures during the 1920s. He started chasing images of tragedy and sensation on the streets of New York City with his camera in the 1940s and established a reputation for being at the scene of the crime before even the police and fire department had arrived. And so he adopted the nickname Ouija, as if he had the foresight of a Ouija board. Here you see him on the left with his famous speed graphic camera and his omnipresent cigar. Ouija worked his magic by having a miniature darkroom and office in the back of his car. He was also the first civilian to have a police radio legally mounted in his car. So he monitored the police calls and got to the scene first to make his remarkable photographs. Here on the right, we see an image of a landlord crying as his tobacco store burns down, a photograph in the Snite collection. In our exhibition, this is the photograph from Ouija representing a homeless man settled down on the street for the night in Hell's Kitchen, having removed his shoes and rubbing his feet right under an official tire inspection sign. Of course, this was probably staged because Ouija loved visual and verbal puns. Many photojournalists distinguished themselves during the period of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. One of them was Dan Budnik, a friend of Notre Dame who visited the university a few years ago to lecture and present us with some of his photographs, including the original print on the left representing Dr. Martin Luther King a few moments after he delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Our photograph in the exhibition by Dan Budnik represents this boy in 1963, weeks after the building of the Berlin Wall. Isolated on the west, he was among the population who spent much of their time trying to peer through and over the wall for glimpses of friends and family that had been isolated by the building of this barrier between the Soviet and American parts of Berlin. In the Vietnam War, Larry Burrows became the most important and influential photographer. English by birth, he spent 9 years in Southeast Asia. He was embedded with the American troops and made several moving photo series of the experience of the American soldiers. Perhaps the most famous of these is One Flight with Yankee Papa 13, published in Life magazine. Burrows accompanied this helicopter gunship crew over a day, during which one of its members was killed in the helicopter. And his selection of photographs representing the effect of those events and that death on the soldier's colleague made a moving impression on the magazine readers. Working for Life magazine, Burrows had the luxury of taking his time, planning his projects, and using the most sophisticated equipment. Burrows was one of the few people in Vietnam to make color photographs because the technology and the equipment was expensive. This is one of the color images that he made in 1962, representing a Huey helicopter landing to bring provisions to an army. Burrows already sensed the importance of the helicopter in this war and enshrined it, and the experience of working with these enormous machines in this famous image. I'm David Acton, curator of photographs at the Snipe Museum of Art, hoping that you can join me again for images from our exhibition, Touchstones of the 20th Century.